Well, good morning, everyone. Wow, I am so excited to be here with all of you and our great speakers today. We have, as of right now, 310 people in the audience, and those numbers are growing by the second here. So this is fantastic to see the amount of interest that everyone has. I'm so excited. So I will introduce our broadcast today. Of course, this is UMass Extension's Invasive Insect webinar series, returning again here in 2021. This is brought to you through a collaboration between the Landscape Nursery and Urban Forestry program, as well as UMass Extension's Fruit program. And it is made freely available by grant funding support through the Specialty Crop Block Grant Program at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So we are very grateful for that support. My name is Tawny Samiski. I am the entomology specialist with UMass Extension's Landscape Nursery and Urban Forestry program, and I will act sort of as a moderator for today's webinars. Before I introduce our first speaker here, I just want to go through a couple of slides with regard to pesticide and association credits, because I'm sure many of you are viewing today in hopes of gaining those, and I just want to answer a couple of questions and come back to this at the end of today's program. So, all instructions for receiving pesticide credit for Massachusetts categories 25, 27, 29, 35, 36, 37, and 48, as well as the applicator's license and association credits, will be shared at the end of this webinar. So please remain on the webinar until the end to receive these instructions. I do need to note that in particular, I believe category 37, there is only one credit available for that today. The rest, if you watch both of our presentations, there are 2 pesticide credits available. I also want to remind everyone to please answer all of the poll questions that will be shared during these presentations. The answers to those poll questions will not be graded, but you must complete them in order to receive your pesticide credit. And when we administer those poll questions, we'll give you some instructions as to how to answer those. So don't worry about that just yet, we'll get there. One thing to note, though, is if you sign off the webinar early or without having answered those poll questions, you will not be awarded pesticide credit. This is a requirement of the Mass Department of Agricultural Resources, so please stay with us to answer those poll questions. And then one last item before I introduce our first speaker, I did want to mention that we have a voluntary and anonymous demographic information survey that I will provide momentarily once we get started with the presentation in the chat. So I will provide you with that link. Don't worry about copying it down right now. This is in order to fulfill our civil rights requirements as a recipient of federal funding. So UMass Extension must report demographic information to the U.S. Department of Agriculture, specifically on gender, race, and ethnicity. But I want to repeat again that this survey is voluntary, so you can skip the entire survey or any question that you do not feel comfortable answering, and it is completely anonymous. We are not collecting any identity or other information with this survey, and we will not be able to link your responses to this survey with your participation in this program. All right, so I am going to give the screen control, hopefully, here we go, over to Olga. And let's see here. Hopefully she has a prompt to take that over now. And I will introduce our first speaker. Of course, this is Dr. Kostromytska, who is here to talk to us today about invasive earthworms in Massachusetts, their biology impacts and research updates. I also, before we get started with your presentation, wanted to mention that I have here with us as well Jeffrey Njue, who is helping us with the technical support for today's webcast. So thank you, Jeffrey, for that. Okay.
I'm trying to show the good morning, everybody. Sorry for technical difficulties. We will start shortly. I'm welcome today on my first I start this webinar today, and I will try to figure out how to share the presenter. Do you see my screen, Tony? No.
I do not currently. Let me turn I'm going to turn my video off, and maybe
Screenshot.
that will also help. Let me give you the prompt to take over again. Oh, you should have it, I think.
Okay. So now, do you see now?
I do not. Let me take it over
Okay,
again.
wait. Yeah. I
Oh,
think I
and then
just saw the
I'll
button, and then you like removed it. Sorry about
sorry. Now I'm going to give it to you one more time. I'm
that. Okay.
sorry.
Okay.
Let's see if you
How
get the
about now?
prompt.
I think now
Yes.
it should be good.
And now you just need to put it in the presentation mode. Perfect.
Okay, so you see it perfectly. You don't need to remove anything. Everything's good, right?
Correct. Go right
Okay,
on
great.
ahead.
Okay, let's start then. If everything's great, so I would like to say a couple words about my expertise and who I am and why I'm doing work on the earthworms. So I'm a third-class entomologist. I joined the UMass in 2018 as a third-class and landscape entomologist. But recently we have some problems with the earthworms, and we will talk about that today. And that's why how I kind of got involved in the earthworm works first, and then I kind of got involved into invasive earthworms, Aminta species. If you talk about invasiveness of earthworms, so what I would like to mention that um, we need to go for, like, kind of discuss a little bit in general what earthworms in our areas is. And if you talk about invasiveness, most of the earthworms that we have here, if not all, they all introduced. And I will, in my first portion of webinar, I will briefly talk about that, and then we'll go to the more recent invasion of the earthworms, which probably all of you came here to listen about. So let's kind of review really briefly biology, phenology, and ecology of earthworms in order to understand what to do with them. You probably need to look what the organism look like, what they doing, and when they doing in our area, and why we need even to care about them. So before we start, one more thing what I want to mention: if you have any questions, please type them in the chat, and we will address them later. Any questions? What do you think? Maybe you have some concerns and everything. And again, I would like to remind you that you will have poll questions throughout the lecture. We will need to answer them. Please make sure not to skip those. So what are earthworms? Earthworms are a really diverse group. It has about 1,800 species at least what known, and they have specific biological characteristics, and they very interesting group of organism. So as an organism, they start their life with the cocoon, and I will try here so you can see the cocoon. Cocoon is not the egg per se. Cocoon is basically like sac, what is created after the mating and after fertilization of the eggs, and it can contain from 1 to 5 eggs of the earthworms, depends on the species. Cocoons usually hatch into the hatchlings, and so you will have this immature or juvenile earthworms, and sometimes they're very small. A lot of times for many species they will be whitish color, and then they will gain the color, gain the size. So first what they do, they kind of grow in size. They add the segments or part of their body and grow in size basically, and when they kind of gain all of this growth what they need, then they mature reproductively. They form this what we call clitellum, and it's like this kind of saddle-like, or usually different color, usually not always. And this is kind of identification or key sign that the earthworms is no longer immature juvenile. It's actually adults, and it's ready for reproduction. Why it's important to know, because we practitioners, why it's important for us. Number one, because we cannot ID the earthworm species with, if they immature. It's not even for field people who works in the field like me, but even for people who actually do studying earthworms, it's almost impossible to identify immature earthworms, 2 species. So that's why sometimes if people submit me samples and it's an old juvenile, I said, I'm sorry, I cannot do it until they develop into the adult. So maybe we need to sample a little bit later to see what we're dealing with. Because one thing why it happens, because the immature just don't have the structures inside and outside, which we can for sure identify for species. And as a matter of fact, identify earthworms is really tricky business, no matter what species they are. And even with the our invasive species, which main point of interest today, it's not that easy, and I will talk about that too. So after they mature, they're ready for reproduction. Reproduction for earthworms, it's very kind of interesting too, because they have both male and female organs. Each worm has both males and female organ on them. And that's why we call them hermaphrodites, because they have both organs present. Some of them can actually fertilize themselves. Some species, it's again, all depends on the species. Some species, they do need mate anyways, and they kind of, as shown here, they kind of mate in a certain time of the year, and because they do need another earthworm to fertilize and continue reproduction. And some of them, the ones especially the crazy worms or jumping worms, Asian worms, what we will talk about today, they don't need mate. They reproduce asexually through the parthenogenesis. That's a scientific word about that. And after they mate it, usually earthworms create this cocoon by shedding this cutellum, this part of their body. I don't know where it's my things, so I lost it. Anyways, but this saddle, when they kind of shed it off, and this whatever it shedded, clitellum, will form this cocoon, which protection layer, which will protect eggs from desiccation and all other kind of adverse factors, and so eggs can stay protected. And that's why it gives this cocoon and eggs really high rate of survivals in very bad environments. So the eggs of earthworms actually can stay dormant for some time, and a lot of time, it's really long time, and they can survive a lot of things. Again, we'll come back to that a little bit later. So here's example in the picture. That was all kind of drawing. Here's the image, actually picture of the cocoons in the soil. I think it's probably most of the nightcrawler cocoons. They yellowish, large size. And here's example how you can distinguish adult worm on the top, and you can see very distinct clitellum, and the immature one, which is right on the below. So it doesn't have this clitellum, really hard to ID and say what species you're dealing with. Here's to show it even more. So that's one part of the story. Another part of the story, it's a diverse group, as I mentioned before, have different species. And another thing what we need to kind of learn that they different in their ecology or behavioral, how they behave in the environment. So we have several different groups of the earthworms, depending what they do in the environment. And again, it's important to know, because it will depends what we can do about that, and what kind of measure, if we need to manage them, or if we need to understand their behavioral, we do need to know this ecological group. So one of the largest earthworms, and this mostly represented by night crawlers, we call them anasic. This group of the earthworms, it means what they burrow making. So they create this one permanent burrow really deep in the soil. They go up and down. They cast a lot of casting happens with that, and they feed on the partially kind of not fresh litter. So they partially already digested or partially kind of processed litter, the leaf debris, and then they take it to the burrows and they feed on that. Another thing, what they do, they create this kind of chambers, as you can see here, where they deposit their cocoons with the eggs. They don't do too many horizontal kind of burrows. Mostly they produce this one permanent vertical ones, and it's important, and it could be really, really deep. Um, And because of this large burrow, they need to excavate a lot of soil, relatively large group of the earthworms. Another group of the earthworms, it's called epigeic, and you can see here this little worm. They usually leaf litter dwelling worms. They feed on the leaf litters, they don't burrow at all, and they kind of feed on whatever it's on the top. And they're usually on the smaller size. Then we have endogeic earthworms, which never go up. They usually stay in this mineral soil profile. They create the very diverse system of this horizontal tunnels with a lot of branches. And because they don't go too much on the top, they're usually pale in color, and they're on the like medium size of the worms. And another group of the earthworms, it's epiendogenic. So basically it can burrow a little bit, don't burrow too deep, and they feed on the litter and stay on the top of the soil most of the time. And this is important to know because one of the group what we will talk today, it's actually epiendogenic. So they do kind of do a little bit of burrowing, but most of the time they do present in the top layer, top of the litter. So, as I mentioned before, today our specific goal is to talk about invasive species. It's partial, a specific group of invasive, because most of them, most of the earthworm in our region is introduced. And a lot of earthworms, what we have here, they actually considered to be invasive because they invade the area. It's in a pretty distant rate. Why they were introduced? So just to remind you that in Northeast was like about 11,000 or 15,000 years ago. It's like I have this really wide window because of the literature specification. So that's what I found in literature, wide kind of window of the time. It was a ice time, right? Ice period, and all of this uh, earthworms were basically wiped out at that time. So we don't have since then Northeast, we don't, and you can see on this picture the kind of the boundaries, where did it go. And so therefore, because of that event in our area, we don't have native earthworms. And our forest, what we have in here, they are evolved to survive without these earthworms. So if we have European earthworm, like maybe southern part of the United States, they need earthworms to function properly, right? To be efficient. In the Northeast, forest ecosystem survived to be adopted to survive without earthworms, and that's did pretty good job without them. But because we have settlers from the Europe, about 30 species of earthworms were introduced, and we call them European earthworms. They were introduced in the 1600s, so a very long time ago, and that's why they very widely distributed, and we no longer consider them invasive because they've been here for a long time. And but they're not native to North America. That's, you just need to keep it in mind that. So are they beneficial and damaging? The question usually arises when we're dealing with introduced organism. We never can just say about the positive or good things. They always, a lot of times, these introduced organisms have this negative effect on the ecosystem where they were introduced. So what about the earthworms? We do know that a lot of earthworms usually associated with benefits for agriculture, for the soil health, and a lot of times they even call intestines of the earth because they're so crucial for the soil health. They aerate the soil, so make the spores, which kind of promote the airflow in the soil and water flow in the soil. So it's very important for soil health. They decompose decaying plant and animal materials, so they kind of play an important role into the nutrient recycles. They great decomposers. And because of that, they enrich fertility of farmlands and gardens, and it's the best friends of the garden. That's what we hear a lot of times for the earthworms. And another thing is what they bring with, like each species of the earthworms bring specific community of microorganisms, such as bacteria, which introduce in the ecosystem and play their role, negative or positive. In terms of urban areas, right, they are great detachers. So that means, like this layer of the turf, which were usually associated with the diseases and pest problem. So earthworms are the number one who will go and feed on this organic matter and detach the turf, which sometimes we do a lot of work to do that mechanically. But if you have a healthy, nice soil and you have a lot of earthworms, they will do it for you. So basically a lot of things what we know about them is great. But a lot of publication, especially with dealing with forest health, and I'm not going in too many details about that because it's not the scope of my presentation today, but just to give you an idea what sometimes what we think is beneficial is not always beneficial. For forest health, this even European, I'm not even talking about our group with the snake earthworms or jumping earthworms, that's only European. They already have some negative effect on the ecosystem of the forest. And here's usually what they do, what's wrong with them. As I mentioned before, that forest in our area evolved to be without the worms. So they do perfectly without the worms. They have this community of the plants which needs this environment with no worms. But when worms come into ecosystem, what happens? So they decompose and they feed on this litter, leaf litter, needle litter, whatever it's in the forest. Especially for deciduous forest is not a good influence of the earthworms. They feed it and they consume it totally. And what happens, they like the roots of the plant sometimes get exposed. The nutrients is not like depleted pretty fast. And so a lot of changes which usually is not beneficial for our forest ecosystem. And here's several examples. So this is a forest which is usually common for our area with a lot of understory, and there's no earthworms in this area of the forest. Here's when earthworm present, you see that understory is totally different. We don't have as much plants as here, and obviously it's changed in the communities. Here's another example, kind of close up look. Here's no earthworm, and here's the earthworms present. So we see different plants, we see different structure of the soil. So it's not characteristics for the ecosystem before they were here, but now when we have them, they definitely change the ecosystem. And usually foresters, they consider them as negative impact on the forest ecosystem. And this is soil profile. So you can see this nice layer of the organic matter without earthworms, and here with earthworms you don't see that much of this layer. You see the mineral oil soil right away. So I will not go into details about this slide. One thing with this one little change in this understory of the forest kind of trickles this changes in entire ecosystem. You think it's a small change, but if you think about it, if you change the understory, you change the animal communities in the forest in this understory. So we have changes in the small mammals, arthropod, and other small animals which live in this understory. Another thing, when you remove the native plants from understory, you promote, it's created favorable condition for the invasive understory plants. So all of this is kind of fun little change will kind of cascade in other changes, which is result in the threatened biodiversity in the native community of the plants and organisms, and it changes the system very significantly. So and we're now talking about the earthworms from Europe, which were here for a long, long time. And what about, this is the forest system, obviously one of the negative aspect. I'm dealing with urban system usually, landscapes, turf, and in this case, what the earthworms can add the negative impact even here too. And this is one example. This is highly maintained turf on the golf courses, and you can see all of these castings of the earthworms. They definitely change the playability of the surface, so we don't have this nice turf for playing. This is the same thing for the sports field, so they can kind of add this castings and it's smother the grass, could definitely ruin the look and the playability of the surface. Not something you would be looking for. And that's why sometimes in this urban turfgrass system, especially, people spend a lot of time thinking how to reduce this casting and what to do about earthworms. And another problem with them, when you try to mow and maintain the grass, that's what happens to equipment. You can see here it's dulls, it's covered with the dirt. So it's definitely something what we don't want it to happen. And I think all the effort, even to reduce the abundance and maybe casting of the earthworms, came from this highly maintained turfgrass areas, because they already dealt with that for a long time, because their requirements not to have this kind of the surface. So what's about their status? Even we're talking about only European, I keep reminding you, are they beneficial or they not beneficial? Are they pests? What should we consider them? So basically the answer will be, it's not that simple, it's complicated, but in the eyes of the EPA and in general, earthworms are considered beneficial, and you need to remember that. They are beneficial. Why? And as a result of that, we don't have any chemical product, or probably will not have them in the near future unless something changes, what will control and will be registered or labeled for specifically for earthworm control. It's just, I want you to keep it in mind. There's no labeled product registered against the earthworms. And obviously we do have people who try to kind of reduce the population, reduce the casting, but it's definitely not easy. Okay, so I joined the project with earthworms exactly from the standpoint of what we're doing in reducing the castings on the displaying surfaces in the turf, and then that's how I got involved into invasive species of the Asian worm. So I started dealing with European species, right? We did some phenology. We collected a lot of earthworms in the area from different places, mostly from the golf courses. And like, just to give you an idea that the most common species what we have, it's result of like at least 2 years right now of study. We have this Lubricus terrestris, which is night crawlers. It's really like one of the largest species what we have here, and it has this like reddish coloration to that, if you see here, right? And this has this clitellum. It's not really too close to the head. It's very important because we will identify another species a little bit later, and it's different. In very interesting characteristic for this species, and its relative, which we'll cover in the next slide, but when they move, they kind of flatten the tail. So if you have, and even immature does it. So with this case, you see here's adult and immature. And if you see the earthworm that kind of flattened the tails at the end, it's European species. It's not a concern, at least in the residential turfs. We don't have that much problem with the European in residential turf. Another species is redhead worm, or Lubricus rubellus. It's kind of rat crawler, sometimes they call it. And it's about the same, very similar to the previous one, a little bit smaller. It's smaller species, and unlike night crawlers, which usually goes in this deep burrow, this one is don't create that deep burrow. It usually feeds on the litter on the top. We have some of this endogeic species, which usually stay in the soil, and we call sometimes some pale earthworms. You rarely will see them. You will see the castings a lot of times, which is not problem for residential landscapes, but you will not see the earth they don't come out unless it's they flooded. So they usually stay in the soil, and they kind of have this pale, hard to ID to species because they look alike, and you need to dissect them to see. So this is the species of European earthworms what we have. They are very common, and sometimes no problem in the landscapes, at least in the urban landscapes, except if it's turf in the golf courses or sports field. And recently, relatively recently, we have this infestation and a lot of reports about jumping worms, snake worms, crazy snake worms, Asian jumping worms, and all this Alabama jumper, all this Jersey wiggler, all of these common names were all about same kind of second wave of introduction worm. And so now, because now it's your time to talk a little bit and to express your opinion. So we're going to the poll questions number 1. And the question is about, have you seen the crazy snake worm infestations in New England? And basically you have some choices, choose that, and we will look at that.
Another quick friendly reminder to everyone, if you're hoping to receive pesticide credit for attending, to answer this poll question.
We have 89% who have answered the question, 99%. If you intend to get pesticide credit, please answer the question in the next few seconds before I close it.
I'm also seeing some questions coming in. Yes, I think to be safe, if you're living in another state, just please answer the poll question. I had a couple folks ask from Connecticut,
yeah, it's fine,
etc. So everybody should answer the poll question. Thank you.
Okay, I'm closing the questions the next 2 seconds. So you can see the percentage. I can see it?
I cannot, yeah, I cannot
okay.
see it.
You cannot?
No, it's okay. You can just announce them. I don't know why I cannot see it. Maybe.
Okay.
Wait a second. No, I cannot. Nothing.
I cannot. Yeah. So 25% answered yes, they have seen at least on one location. Okay. 34% have said they have not seen but have heard of them from customers or colleagues. 34% have said they have not seen or heard about them, and 7% have said they are not sure what they are.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for responding to the question. This was actually very interesting. So at least we have about 50%, something like that, a little bit more than 50% in the 40, division 50 something and 40%, at least from what I did, like simple math. So some of you heard and seen those Asian worms, right? Like this introduced second invasive worms. But large group of people still didn't see it, didn't heard about that. So that's probably interesting. So what are those? What is the second wave of earthworm invasion? And this, the second wave is definitely much more invasive and problematic compared to the European, or like earthworms. So, and usually when we talk about this crazy worms because of their behavior, we'll talk about that in a few slides. It's 3 different species. So it's not one species, even though they look similar, but it's species complex, and this kind of adds the complexity and problems dealing with them. So it includes Aminta agrastis, Aminta tokiensis, and Metaphyre, like hard to pronounce, Hilgerdorfi. So it's 3 different species. So Aminta agrastis, in this on the picture of A, it's medium size compared to others, and it has, as you can see here, the main like medium size, and then the picture A, and it has this very distinct white clitellum. If we saw in the previous earthworms, what I showed you before, they have this kind of similar colors to the entire color of the earthworms. This crazy worms, or this Aminta species, they have this white color, very white color, and this clitellum is really close to the head. This is, as you can see here. So the Aminta grass is most common, but it's more like medium size. Another thing, another species in the complex, it's here's under letter B, it's Aminta tokiensis. And this is the smallest one, even though this is no scales, but it's usually the smallest species out of all of them. So the Aminta agrastis is about 3 to 6 inches. Aminta tokiensis, it's about 1 to 5 inches. And the largest one will be Metaphyre hilgendorfi. And it could reach up to 7 inches. So it's really large earthworms, as you can see here. So sometimes when you see those earthworms, you will see different sizes of them, and that's will be because of this different species present there. So what are those? What are those snake worms? They originally came from Asia. And if we talk about the previous one, they introduced species, but we know they've been there for a long time. They introduced from Europe, different climate, right? And they will have different temperature requirement, different behavior through the season, different life cycle. And so that's the difference came from the like kind of country of origin or place of origin. Another thing what is special about those earthworms, they're really fast moving and very active. A lot of times homeowners and people who dealing with the landscape management, they notice them because they're moving so fast, and they remind the snake, and that people don't like it. People get spooked by them, and they just don't like them without no negative effect. It's just nuisance for people. They don't like their behavior. They do, and obviously the fact what they epiendogeic, meaning what they live in this top layer and feed on the top layer, doesn't help, because they're very close to surface and they're very close to contact. You easy to see and notice, especially when people blow the leaves, you will see that. Another thing what different for this group of the earthworms, they really voracious feeders. They feed a lot, feed really fast, and usually come in large groups. And that makes them to consume the organic matter really fast, which therefore sometimes people prefer them for the composter, as a composter species, which not really good in this case. And After they feed, and it's very different again from the earthworms that we talked before, European one, which they usually contribute to the soil structure. They make the spores and they make it more aerate the soil, and the water flow is good. This species, after they eat, they form this really tight pellets rich in different nutrients. And sometimes when you have a lot of infestation of this snake worms or Asian worms, you have soil looking like coffee ground. And it's easy to kind of, so basically this fast moving earthworms, soil looks like coffee ground, and that's the first sign that maybe you have the infestation of the earth, like this Asian worms. So in 2020, I definitely, compared to previous years, I definitely felt like influx of report about this like Asian snake worms. Basically, I receive almost reports from every county in the Massachusetts. Like a lot of reports didn't have the location, unfortunately. And so people were reporting that, and this is confirmed cases where we actually dealing with the this Asian invasive species. So why in 2020 we see this influx of this worms, even though they've been present from 1940s, 1950s? I think because we had really mild winter, number one, it's probably contributed to their kind of fast development and larger abundance. They survive better. More cocoons survive. That's why we have larger populations. It's definitely contributed to that. And other ones, it's overall, the warm weather pattern from year to year contributes to building up the population. And people become more aware of the species presence. That's definitely another factor why we've seen such influx in the reports about the species. So I think the most reports what I got when articles about the jumping wars was published in New York Times. Then after these articles, I definitely start seeing a lot of them. But I just like presented this kind of interview, what was kind of taken in 2013. And that time, this already had this earthworm, but I definitely didn't see this a lot of reports and people being concerned about this species. So definitely in 2020, I see that people concerned and want to do something about it. Do we need to do something? Should we be concerned? And what needs to be done? So is it how they different from European earthworms? So first of all, feeding habits. As I mentioned before, they eat fast, they eat a lot, and they come in large numbers. So you definitely will see the infestation. And something which you will normally don't see with the European, because they more spread out. Even if you have a lot of them, you don't see as much. They're not as visible. So next one, after they come with this group, you will see a lot of coffee ground. Soil looks like coffee ground. And this is pose some danger in terms of them coming in large groups, feeding so much. Do you remember I talked about that in the forest system, even European earthworms cause a problem by consuming rapidly this organic layer, right? This leaves and everything, they consume more and they cascading all of these changes in the forest. Imagine with these snake worms or these Asian worms, different common names for those, they feed even more. They feed faster, they come in large numbers, so they will definitely consume this organic matter much faster than Europeans. So they kind of, for forest system, they definitely have this more potential of being disruptive. And that's what we have reports from the forest, from people who do research in forest. They definitely report the swarms as have potential risk for the ecosystem. Another thing what they actually do, and which we need to be concerned in urban system, it's when they feed, this pellet's actually loaded with the nutrients. So it's not that bad, because actually they're more available for the plants, you think, right? But the fact with this, what they make it compact in these pellets, it actually makes them not easy be available. So it's kind of harder for roots to get the nutrients from these pellets. And another thing is that because of the kind of tighten this balance, they cause the root aerification. So roots are exposed to the air, they tend to dry out, and that's not good for the plants. And another thing, ecology is different. If you remember that we had night crawlers, which create these burrowers, right? They create this nice one burrow very deep. And we had endogenic, which stay in the soil profile. This species usually litter dwelling species, and they will be visible, so they will stay in the top layer of organic and consume everything there. So rate of reproduction is different. So they do tend to reproduce a little bit faster because they don't need mate. So they don't need to mate. As soon as they're reproductively ready, they will deposit the cocoon and reproduce. They produce usually 1-2 eggs per cocoon, and they hatch pretty fast. And each worm can produce about 60 cocoons per season. So that's why this rapid explosion sometimes you can see. Life cycle will be different, and we need to talk about that in a little bit more details, because they mature usually faster than European earthworms, as I mentioned before. They active all summer. And remember, I said they coming from the Asia, which different climate compared to the Europe. So European earthworms usually tend to be more tolerant to the colder temperature, and Asian earthworms, they more tolerant to the warmer temperatures and not tolerant to the cold. And that's what's the main difference in their life cycle. So if you look at the regular night crawlers, which we're familiar with and been here forever, they usually mate in April, then they deposit their cocoons, and hatch happens in about 2-3 weeks, and then they grow, like kind of getting larger a little bit, and it takes about 2 to 3 weeks, and then they develop clitellum about by 6 weeks. So it's relatively short time. But because the European earthworms usually more tolerant to the cold temperature, they don't tolerate high temperature. So for them, it takes 1 year to mature only, because during the summer, when the hot and dry condition, they go dormant. They don't do anything, they're not active, and they go a little bit deeper to kind of stay alive and in a good shape. And from our observation, what we see now, we see juveniles usually abundant in late spring and fall. And these worms can live about 4 to 8 years. So they're not 1 year living earthworms. A mental or a crazy earthworm, they usually overwinter as cocoons, because all the adults die when it's at first frost. As soon as the first frost hit, usually the all worms will die off, and only cocoons, and not all of them, but big proportion of them will survive and hatch in the spring. And by summer, they will reach reproductive maturity and lay more cocoons. And as you can see from that, they have annual life cycle. So they have only 1 year life cycle. It takes about 1 year, and then they die off. They don't live more than 1 year. Even if they lab with all the temperature requirements that they need and food, they don't usually go beyond the February. By February, they will die. They just not programmed to live longer. And because they like warmer temperature, they don't undergo dormancy in summer. So they don't stay dormant. They're active throughout the summer, and therefore they're very noticeable. And they can reproduce more. They have more potential to cause more changes, what we don't want in ecosystem. In terms of temperature sensitivity, I mentioned before, I will not go into details because we don't have much time, but cocoons usually need about 40-degree Fahrenheit to trigger their hatching. If it's they usually they need about 5 to 6 weeks to be exposed to temperature higher than 40 before they hatch. So usually we will probably expect them to hatch in our areas about like end of April. And most hatching, its most favorable condition occurs in about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. and they can tolerate up to 95 degrees. So they really heat tolerant and be active and don't go dormant. I want to give you an example, so you kind of not only have the information and just some example what happened when invasion. One time when we noticed invasion on the golf course, it's of the green stinky worms. It's not the same species what we have, but it's the same genus, very closely related Asian kind of earthworms. They create a lot of mess. Why I want to show you that case, it just the research was done by Daniel Porter. It's researchers in Kentucky. He actually, and this is the life cycle in terms of the months when they were most present. And as you can see here, all the summer months, they're more abundant compared to and they're not present during the winter at all. So they die off. It's true about the species what we have here in our area. And so how do I do? So the bottom line from what we learned so far, people are concerned about these earthworms in the urban system. For forest system, they definitely have more potential to create disruption. For urban system, I only a couple of times I heard about them being detrimental to the turf, but they actually make it weaker because of the root exposure. Haven't heard too many complaints about damage yet so far. People do find them mostly in the raised beds, in the compost, what they bought somewhere. And again, no detrimental effect on the plants. Even what people report, what the growth of the plants increased because of fast release of these nutrients. Not really good sometimes for the vegetable production, but other than that, I don't hear the bad reports about them. Well, the most things what we're dealing with them, because they in large numbers, people don't like to have them on their property and they concern. But other than that, so far, not really big disruption in urban system I heard about them. So how to ID? Because a lot of times when you find the earthworms, you're like, oh, this is a crazy Asian worm, especially if you hear all the news everywhere. So how to ID them? So first thing what you need to look at, it's on the clitellum, which present only an adult worm. So if you have immature, you probably will not be able to ID using that thing. So, and here's the nightcrawler, right? You can see that clitellum is not really white. It has some reddish color to that, and it's located kind of far away from the head. This is the head, right? If you look in the Asian earthworms, so it's very kind of close to the head, the clitellum, and it's really white. It's compared to entire color, it's much lighter than the color of the body. Another thing you can notice just looking at depiction images, it's the color. So the usual worm has the reddish color and kind of sometimes pale to the end. With the Asian worms, what we have, it's a reddish color, tends to be more brown, sometimes grayish, and they have iridescence to them a lot of times. So if you see it, so kind of something like iridescent color to them. And they, again, on this picture, you can see what they move kind of in the S shape. So they snake kind of moving, and that's another really distinct characteristics of the species. What movement is really fast. So if you disturb them, they kind of thrash in them an S-like pattern, not just crawl, not like curl, they actually S-shaped pattern. And when you touch them, sometimes they detach the tail. That's another characteristic which other earthworms don't do it. And another idea, if you have the infestation of the Asian earthworms, you will have this earth which look like grains, coffee grains, packed coffee grains. So how do they disperse? How do people how they disperse so fast? At least what we see so far, they are present from the Georgia to Maine right now. So they very common right now, and they're present everywhere. So usually natural dispersal, in spite of they move really fast, it's not that much. It's more than regular or European earthworms, which but not as great. It's about 40 feet per year, which is not that much. But the most things how they move around, it's using humans activity. So a lot of times they don't like mulch per se, but they definitely, because they stay in this layer, a very top layer of the soil, they definitely picked up and move a lot of biomulch. Another things, it's a compost. I have so many reports and people say that we got them with compost. I cannot prove either that's true or not, but a lot of times it is associated with the compost. So this is another thing where you need to be careful about. Doing any activities or like cleaning and maintenance of the landscapes can definitely disperse them by moving the litter from one side to another. So definitely it helps to kind of move them around and disperse. A lot of times they spread with plants. It's another main kind of dispersal. And two other things, it's kind of something which should be prevented and easy to prevent. Because they're such voracious feeders, as I mentioned before, and they convert the organic matter into the casting so fast, people who do vermiculture or composting using the earthworms, they interested in buying them as a vermiculture species. Not a good idea. So other species, probably not this species, they don't do as much good things as they could potentially cause a problem. So avoiding buying them, and a lot of times I try to buy worms, I bought totally different species. It's not always precise, and they not always include species what you ask them, Tom. And I found a couple of the Asian jumping worms in the kind of worms what I bought, which shouldn't be there. And another things, they make a really good bait, because fishing bait. So that's another thing when people buy them and they distribute them faster than they should go around. So now we're going for the poll questions number 2. So from everything what I said, what are the visual cues what helps to identify crazy worms? And you should choose all what apply.
Again, another friendly reminder to everyone to please answer the poll question, especially if you are looking for pesticide credit. Thank you.
All questions will be closed in a few seconds, so please make sure that you answer before it's closed. Okay, so these are the results for the poll questions.
Okay, I will just tell the results. So, so basically, the correct results, because it's kind of quizzing what you just heard, everything but flatter in the tail while moving. So all the characteristics except number 2 should be good.
Yeah, most people got it right.
Okay, good, perfect. So, okay, so now we know how to ID, now we know what they are. So what do we do about that? The thing is, not too many things available for the earthworms, as I mentioned before. They consider to be beneficial in spite of all these reports about the forest health, about the possibility of risk, what they can bring in urban system. They are beneficial. So we cannot, there's no chemicals that will be labeled or registered for their controls. So, but obviously people were trying to do something about earthworms, and it started with European ones. So the first target was European ones. And what they use, it's, you probably heard, many of you probably heard about that. People ask me a lot, about this compound for the jumping worms. It's a tea seed meal extract which contain the saponins. And the one we have several different products. They work depends on each other. And the main one was the early bird, and they marketed as the organic fertilizer containing tea extract. So it has tea extract, but it was a fertilizer. And you need to remember that we don't have the product specifically targeting earthworms. The only thing what we can hope that if you need to remove them, if you do something else, earthworms will be non-target effect. It's non-target effect. In this case, early bird, it is number one, it is fertilizer. It's not product to remove the earthworms by no means, but it has this side effect. And this is a kind of example what it does to earthworms. A lot of times it brings them up and they dry out. And at least that's what it was says before. So they die from the sun, not from the product. People later on have problems to remove the earthworms which come out. So it's not a product for the earthworms. That's why I put huge kind of cross sign, because it's not specifically, it's a fertilizer, but it's can brain. And in addition to what it's not a product for fertilizer, right? It's no longer available. So it's kind of no longer produced. It was something what worked really well, but it's no longer produced. We don't have it. They may remarket it, but it will be only available for golf courses. So for landscapes, we don't have anything really. So what the people can do about them? So usually the extraction works, but it's really localized and really semi-efficient. I do extraction with hot mustard powder, diluting it in the water, about 2-3 ounces per 1 gallon of water, and I use it for sampling. I've heard people using it for control around the gardens, around the flower beds, if they really concerned about having the worms. It brings them up. Usually, my experience is a good thing for the European earthworms because they're deeper. It brings them up. These guys, I think sometimes it's more effort to put this solution to extract them than just pick them up, because sometimes, yeah, they will come up in about 10 minutes after you apply that. So if you want to try it, something people to consider. Soapy flush, using soap as a flush of them. Sometimes it doesn't work as well hot mustard. In some cases it works. Why? We don't know, but sometimes it can bring them up, but not all of them, and not as much as hot mustard. Good research was done about what heat actually kills the worms and cocoons. So when you hear about that heat kills the worms and cocoons is harder to kill because they can withstand more a higher temperature compared to the actual living worms. So if you know what the treatments kills the cocoons, definitely you will get rid of the living worms. Just one kind of comments. And the temperature which kills the cocoons is not that high. It's only 1.4 Fahrenheit. And most standard procedure would use to process all the compost in the nurseries and the production of the compost, they have much higher temperature. So they should get rid of the worms. Actually, here's the temperature, 131 Fahrenheit. It's much higher than that. But why we still having problem? Possibility. Not we haven't proven that they kind of transmit from the people who heat treat the compost and other soil. Pitfall sometimes could be dirty equipment what they use before they do sterilization or heat treatment and after. So they can produce introduce the cocoons, which are really tiny and usually dark for this species. It's hard to see, and cold spots, those little spots in the area which just don't get that high temperature. What about the plants? So plants obviously you cannot heat treat, so you need to kind of do something else. So out of this kind of suggestions, so not what we can do about these worms, it's kind of prevent them from spreading. Number one, then when you bring or move any mulch or compost, you need to be very careful. A lot of times if it's done not in the spring, but in the end of the summer, which not likely to happen, but if it happens that time, you can find the worms. Looking for the cocoons, impossible, you will not see them. So therefore, maybe like kind of to have this insurance what you don't bring them, try to choose the supplier with which have the standard procedures, so certified suppliers. So they go with this from heat treating and everything, so to reduce the risk of introduction. What can be done at home in the conditions, like kind of in the landscapes on a small scale, if it's about gardens, flower bed, definitely it could be solarization. It's used to kill a lot of different pests. It works for the earthworms, but you do need to do it for several weeks to reach the temperature, and during the hot season, in order to get the temperature what you need to get rid of them. And obviously we cannot do it in the turf areas because it will kill the turf too. In terms of the plant in the cornel, one of the suggestions, what they recently suggest, is bare root kind of planting, advisable if you have the risk of the reintroduction of these earthworms, so you don't kind of spread them around. And this is example. So if you have the potted plants, it's suggested if you worry about that, if you don't want them on your property, or you heard about the risk of infestation, wash off the roots before you plant, and don't put the soil what you washed off, dispose of the soil. Other things with being like kind of research about, and biochar and earthworms. So I think in Wisconsin University, people try to do research about the biochar and earthworms, hoping the hypothesis for them was that they will eat it and it's abrasive, it will destroy the guts and earthworms will die. Other research out there in the literature showed that it's only short-term, kind of adding the biochar as a soil amendment will kind of repel the earthworms, more likely because of water potential, not because of the abrasiveness. But after 4.5, about 4.5 months, they're usually back. So they'll lose the repellent effect. Okay, and now the last poll questions, and I think we should be done there because the time is up. So true or false, earthworms are considered to be beneficial, and there is no chemicals or the product labeled or registered for their control.
Poll is closing in a few seconds. Okay, the results, 97% true,
Yes.
3% false.
Yeah, so the correct answer will be obviously true. So we don't have any registered product for us for now. Okay, Jeffrey, should I continue or just stop it there?
I think we need to stop there. Sorry for me to butt
sorry.
in.
Yeah, like
because
I thought I will be faster than that. I don't know why I'm so slow.
No, you went over a lot of great information, and I know we've eaten through our scheduled break. I'm wondering if maybe we can allow folks to take a 5-minute break. Olga, I did want to say I have over 35 questions waiting from the audience here. So there have been a lot of questions. Folks are saying great presentation. I think maybe the most important one that I want to give you the chance to answer live is to clarify. I had someone concerned that these worms are potentially harmful to humans, and they asked specifically if they can harm people if you walk over them with your bare feet. I believe this person is probably thinking of something else, but I just wanted to give you the opportunity to answer that question.
So about the harm of the earthworms, what we're dealing with. first of all, we don't, like I said before, we don't even have reports what they terribly harmful for the plants. So they definitely not harmful for the people at all. They don't bite, they don't stain, they don't have any like it's just earthworms, and on the touch they will be even drier than normal ones, so they don't have too much mucus as much as in terms they're not pleasant obviously because of their movement, but in terms of the harm for the people, they not like I'm handling them with my bare hands and they don't do anything, so no, they're not.
Thank you. And I have a lot of other excellent questions. And to put you on the spot, can we can we send you those after the
Yes,
presentation?
yes,
And
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And if you
okay,
need, I will, because I couldn't go from my research, which we did, which kind of related to that. So I might, if you would like, if you're interested, I can make it available in terms of like PDF or like slides or something like that, so people can look at that.
excellent. Okay, we will use the registration information to send folks from the audiences their questions to you. And if you have time and are able to respond back to them, that would be great. I did want to point everyone's attention to the chat because I've had some questions. This presentation is being recorded today and it will be posted on the website that I've shared with you in the chat. And I've also shared the link to the previously mentioned survey there as well. All right, well, thank you so much, Dr. Kostromytska. I am so happy that you gave this very needed and excellent presentation. Thank you everybody for tuning in. We will have another presenter momentarily, but maybe we can give folks a minute or two break while we get Nicole set up to speak.
Okay, thank you for attention. And I will try to, like, I have access to the like questions, maybe I will try to answer them, or no, I don't have access. Anyways, yeah, thank you.
Thank you again. Nicole, I know everyone can still hear us, but I did just want to ask, can you do a microphone test here?
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. I can hear you. All right, and I can see you. Let me turn mine back on. Okay, let's see. So why don't we share your screen so we can make sure your presentation is showing.
Yeah.
Okay, Tony, I can leave, right?
Yes, thank you so much. Have a good day.
All right, you guys should be able
perfect.
to see my screen.
Just put it on this slideshow mode.
All right.
Okay.
Awesome.
So Tony,
Nicole, I can. Oh, go ahead.
Did you say you wanna give people maybe 5 minutes break and then we can start?
Yes, yeah, let's start. Oh boy, I don't want to start too late here. We're almost let's start at like 11:16.
Okay.
And then Nicole, I will introduce you, and I do want to say again to thank everybody for sending such excellent questions in the chat. I'll try to keep up with those for this second presentation, and we'll share the Go ahead.
Is it possible for me to see the questions in the chat? Because sometimes I can keep an eye on them while I go through and answer. They don't show up in my chat.
On the chat, but not on the question box. So most questions come through the question box and you don't have the question box on your control panel.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, I did have another good question come in. I had a person who was interested in the Category 37 turf credits only and asking if they have to stay on for this next presentation. While I do encourage everyone who joined us for the first talk to remain on and listen to our second presentation this morning, if you are only interested in the turf information specifically, no, you do not have to technically stay on. Just make sure when you exit the webinar, you should be able to see a prompt to answer some survey questions in order to get your pesticide credits. So make sure that you answer those survey questions that GoToWebinar will prompt you to answer. But I don't want to confuse everyone else. I do hope that folks will remain on for this second presentation, and then I will explain the pesticide credit as well as association credit information at the end of the presentation. Okay, Nicole, I think we should probably get started again if you are ready.
Yeah, I'm ready to go.
All right, so let me please introduce Nicole Keleher. We are grateful to have her here speaking with us today. She is the director of the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation's Forest Health Program, and she will be giving us an update on 2021 forest health in Massachusetts. So please, Nicole, take it away.
Thank you, Tani. So my name is Nicole, and the Forest Health Program, for those of you who don't know, we basically work on any insect and disease issues across the state in our forests, mostly big picture kind of things that impact most of our native trees, but we do deal with some smaller isolated incidents, some urban things, some things out in the forest, and we do a lot of surveying, monitoring, on the ground treatments. So today I'm going to go through and kind of talk about what we saw last year in 2020 out in the world of forest health and kind of what we're expecting coming into 2021 this year. And usually I have a really nice, beautiful map like this to show you. This is actually from 2019. This year we were not able to fly and collect our aerial survey data. It is very hard to maintain social distancing inside a tiny Cessna with 3 people. So we weren't able to collect our data set like we usually do and get these really good kind of quantifiable numbers and a real good big picture snapshot of the health of our forests. We did use other tools available to us to try to fill in some of those gaps. The biggest one was using a product called Forewarn. It's produced by the U.S. Forest Service, and it uses satellite imagery to detect vegetation signatures and then compares the signatures it's detecting to that same time period the 5 years previous. So seeing if there's deviation in how your plants are growing this year compared to your recent years. This is the kind of output we get from it. Green means all things are good, looks the same as usual year status quo. Blue is actually your vegetation growth is actually better than the previous years. Yellow, it's a little bit worse, and then when you get into those oranges and reds, those are the areas that we're kind of concerned about and can highlight that there is some sort of forest problem. And this is a tool that's actually used a lot out west in areas where it's harder to access, areas where flying can be a lot more challenging, getting over the terrain. And it is really useful for them out on these bigger, larger scale forests. But for us here in Massachusetts, it wasn't a great tool because we just have so much urban interface. Even in our rural communities, we have roads, we have homes, we have agriculture. So some of the things that were showing up as the oranges and reds weren't even tree issues. It was just a change in a field use for the year, or someone had logged an area, or a new housing development went up. So we didn't actually find much going on in the state, which is good news. Something like this would pull out a big effect. The years we had the big gypsy moth outbreak, it was very noticeable on satellite data like this. So we actually didn't have any huge issues across the state, and we actually had a lot of areas that were actually doing much better this year because we came out of that gypsy moth event. So our trees were healthier, had more leaves, were a little bit more robust. The biggest issue this year across the state was the drought that we saw. So throughout pretty much most of the growing season, we went through periods of most of the state going through some level of drought conditions, and this continued well into the fall. So at some point, all of the state was at one level of drought, and at certain points, almost 80% of the state was in severe drought levels. So this is kind of a reoccurring issue, and drought can have a lot of direct and indirect effects on our tree health. So we didn't see too much direct damage this year, but sometimes the impact of a drought on our forests takes 2 or even 3 years to really show itself and kind of see those long-term impacts from it. And it kind of ties into this bigger issue of the impact of changing climate conditions on our forest health. And as our climate is changing, it's going to change in a lot of different facets, and it's going to produce a lot of direct and indirect changes to our forests and plays a huge role in forest health, and kind of ties into all the topics I'm going to hit today. And the big things are we're going to see increased temperatures. So we're going to have warmer winters, we're going to have longer growing seasons, and it really opens us up to a lot of new invaders that are coming in. As Olga spoke about, we're having more signs of earthworms because we were having warmer soils due to warmer winters and warmer summers. So invaders that weren't able to survive here in our Northeast conditions that might have been killed off in the winters might be able to make it now. So we are opening ourselves up to more insects that can come in. And then insects that are already here, both native and non-natives, can cause more damage when they're given this longer growing season and warmer winters to kind of keep being productive. We're also going to expect to see changes in our precipitation patterns. So in the Northeast, we're not expected to get too much more or less precipitation, but the way we receive that precipitation is really going to change. And we're going to have times when we're going to go through longer periods of drought. So we're going to see a decline in our drought sensitive species. We're going to see rainfall in more shorter severe events. And how we receive precipitation and moisture also impacts things like fungal pathogens. So fungal pathogens that are directly attacking trees can kind of be altered, but also there are beneficial funguses that kind of keep things like Entomophaga mimega, which keeps gypsy moth under control, can really be devastated by having a dry spring or dry conditions that don't allow it to complete its life cycle. We're also going to see increased storm events. So this year we had a lot of wind events. We had tropical storms, derechos, and those caused direct damage to our trees, knocking over huge mature trees, breaking limbs. Just the events of the storm, heavy snowfall earlier or later can cause a lot of damage. This picture is from 3 years ago when we had those late March storms that caused a huge amount of wind burn to our pitch pines out on our coast. So these are causing a lot of direct stress onto our trees, which then opens them up to being susceptible to secondary invaders. So insects and diseases have a much easier time being able to invade into these trees, and it can eventually cause mortality. And then having damage, even small breaking of branches, can kind of open up vectors for diseases and insects to get into trees. So things like oak wilt disease can be spread through damage caused by storms. So kind of when you address any kind of forest health issue, we're kind of always in the back of our minds keeping how the changing climate is going to impact this. So the decisions we're making, the approaches we're making are really changing from how things were historically managed because of the way our climates are changing, and kind of taking those alterations and possibilities into consideration for long-term plans is really important. So kind of diving into our specific pests and diseases, I'm going to jump in with emerald ash borer, which I'm sure all of you know a ton about. You've heard about it a lot, but kind of new news in emerald ash borer world is, as of January 15th, the federal quarantine is no longer in place. So the USDA had been establishing a federal quarantine throughout the United States, but as the insect has spread and moved, the quarantine wasn't as effective, and instead of maintaining this and keeping up on the quarantine, they're moving resources and abilities away from that and more towards things like biocontrols and other programs related to emerald ash borer that work more on the control end instead of the regulatory end. So here in Massachusetts, it actually does not change much for us. So all of the states surrounding us have emerald ash borer already. We had been under an entire state quarantine for the past 6 years, and our state regulations still stay in place. So our state regulations are, we have a boundary at our state bounds that regulate the movement of wood out of our state into other states, but within our state, we still have the ability to move products around. We just very much encourage people to not. So anytime you're dealing with any ash materials, even if you're in an area that you don't think has EAB, act like you do. So consider chipping if you're going to move it, or using wood locally or on site to avoid spreading it into any other new communities. We currently, so this map was made about 3 weeks ago, where we had 169 communities in Massachusetts that we have positively detected emerald ash borer. So that's 11 of our counties. The only counties we haven't found it are Barnstable, Dukes, and Nantucket, and most of that is due to there's very little ash resource out on those coastal areas. We still do look out there and we do follow up on reports, but we have not found it out in those areas yet. But through most of the state, it's pretty widespread. Just in 2020 alone, we found it in 70 new communities. And since this map was created, my team's been out there following up on reports and doing their own surveys. The winter is a great time to be able to find emerald ash borer damage, and I think they've already added 5 or 6 new towns to this map. So we're always finding in new areas. It's well established throughout our state at this point. So we kind of have stepped away from some of the traditional monitoring methods we used. 10 years ago, you would have seen those purple panel traps everywhere across the state. They're nice and sticky. Then we kind of moved to the green funnel traps, and we used girdle trap trees. But the way our population levels are right now, the populations are pretty advanced. Damage is pretty easy to be seen. We've identified a lot of areas in most of the counties. So we've kind of stepped away from these monitoring methods that are a little more time intensive. And we really just utilize visual surveys in the winter now. So it's easy to pick an ash out of a forested stand. Their bark's very distinctive. They have nice fat twigs that go out to nice fat buds. So it's really easy. They kind of pop against the background of other trees. So it's easy for us to go out in teams of 2 and just do windshield surveys where we kind of drive through, see if we see ash, and then look if we see kind of any of these distinguishing symptoms. So looking to see, the number one thing we see a lot in the winter is blonding. So woodpeckers will move up and down the tree, going through and feeding on the larvae. And so their feeding causes these ragged little holes, usually between the size of a dime and a quarter, depending on the kind of woodpecker. But their little feet scurrying up and down the tree and their little beaks looking for the larvae do cause a lot of the bark to slough off on an ash, which causes this patterns where you can see the lighter colors. Looking for areas that have epicormic sprouting, so that lower sprouting where the tree is just trying to get any energy it can out, so just putting out these lower sprouts to try to survive. And then when we see that, we kind of go in and look and see if we can find larvae and these S-shaped galleries. So EAB always makes these pretty nice continuous S-shaped galleries going from top to bottom. Sometimes the fatter end will be on the top, sometimes the fatter end will be on the bottom, but always moving up and down and maintaining that nice shape. The picture on the far right is when you have a huge, dense population, a tree that's been infested for several years. You can still see where the S-shaped galleries are, but as they kind of run out of room to feed, an area to feed, they'll start to overlap each other, and it can be a little trickier to see those patterns. But this is what we usually find in the winter when we're doing our surveys now. So we do work on establishing biocontrol species throughout the state. So these are parasitic wasp species. So I say wasps, but they don't sting people. They have a little, what looks like a stinger coming out of their butt, but it is actually called an ovipositor, and that's where they actually get their eggs out of their body and into the emerald ash borer. So we've released at 23 sites across the state in 7 of our counties. Next year, our goal is to add an additional 4 new sites, which include 2 new counties. So we work with the USDA APHIS. They have a rearing facility out in Michigan, and they rear these insects out and then mail them to us. So once a week, we'll just get a big old box full of, so some come in these little bolts, some will come in little tubes, and some we get as the live wasps in little cups. And we set them out across the state. So we've released 3 different species, Tritasticus planipensis and Spatheus galeni. Both are larval parasitoids, so they inject their eggs directly into an EAB larvae. So they go through the bark and put their eggs right into the EAB, feeding under the bark surface. And then Ubius agrilli, which is an egg parasitoid, which puts its egg inside an EAB egg. So we are working on getting these kind of widely established across the state. We find sites that has a good population density of emerald ash borer, but still has some healthy ash. So we know that EAB will be present in that site for the next few years and allow these insects to kind of establish and grow. And then as the EAB population moves on to new areas, the wasps will be able to move with them. And these don't protect the trees at the sites that we release them at. But the goal is to protect our future generations of ash. So we can allow these insects to become established throughout our area with the emerald ash borer population. So as we get through this initial wave of EAB, move into subsequent generations of ash and emerald ash borer waves, we have some control that'll help minimize the impact and size of those populations. We do also treat with pesticides sometimes. So there are a few pesticide treatment options. When we treat on DCR properties, we use emamectin benzoate. So it is directly injected into the tree, and the tree kind of absorbs it up and moves it throughout the tree. It's a systemic pesticide. So any insects that try to get into the tree are impacted by that. And even if there's a low level of EAB already in that tree, it can kill them. If you have moderate to high populations infested already in that tree, it won't be able to overcome them. But it is a good tool. It can be expensive. It is time intensive. You have to do it every 2 years. And ash can also, on urban ash, it can be challenging. So trees that might get like hit by snow plows or weed whackers or mowers have some damage underneath the bark. And it can kind of restrict the movement of the material through the tree. So you're not getting a nice even distribution of that pesticide, which can negatively impact the success of the pesticide treatment. So we use this mostly in areas where we have high priority ash that are culturally or ecologically important. We treat very few trees in the state just because it's not the best choice for us on our properties, but for homeowners or individuals that are interested in protecting their trees, there are some options available. All right, so jumping into our first poll question. So when was the emerald ash borer first detected in Massachusetts?
All question will be closing soon, so make sure you answer it in the next few seconds. Okay, so the results 2005, 2005 19%, 2008 25%, 2012 44%, 2014 11%.
All right. Thank you, Jeffrey, for running that poll. So the correct answer is C, 2012. And I just want to mention that's the first year we detected it. So we found it out in Dalton, Massachusetts, through our purple panel traps. But it was likely here before that. It does take time for emerald ash borer to be detectable when you have these low-level populations in your tree. It takes a few years for there to be damage. It takes a few years sometimes for there to be enough adults flying around to catch them in traps. But we did first detect them in 2012. All right, moving on to our next disease is beech leaf disease. So this is a brand new disease to Massachusetts. It is a fairly newly identified disease in general. It was first identified in 2012 out in Lakes County in Ohio. So someone working out in the metro parks there noticed some weird looking damage on their beach. And at first I thought maybe it was drought stress, maybe it was insects. And it took actually until 2016 to confirm that it was actually being caused by a nematode. So it's spread rapidly since then. Most of it was kind of moving out along that Great Lakes area into Pennsylvania, New York, onto the Canadian side of the lakes as well. But in the last 2 years, it's really jumped and made a big move. First getting into New York and Connecticut in the Hudson Valley area and Long Island. But then this year we found it here in Massachusetts for the first time out in Plymouth. And it was also the first year they found it in Rhode Island. So it's kind of made a jump. We don't really know. There's still a lot of unknowns about the disease. So we know that there is this nematode associated with it. It is causing foliar damage, but it's not really known how it infects leaves, how it's moving, how it's being transported. So it's a bit of a mystery. We still don't know if there are other factors associated with the nematodes. So some nematodes have bacteria, viruses, or funguses associated with them, or if there's a mite associated with the nematode that allows it to move. So it is still a bit of a mystery. We'll be doing research plots here in Massachusetts, and the rest of New England will be doing those as well to help monitor and track how this disease progresses in our landscape. So it's easily identified by this dark banding it causes on leaves. So the nematode is present in the bud before the leaves come out. So as soon as leaf emergence happens, you'll be able to identify these symptoms. So it causes a darkening between the veins of a leaf. So it infects all beech. It infects all American beech, European beech, and ornamental beech, and all cultivars within those. So most of the time, you're looking at green leaves, it'll be a darker green bands. Where you have like the copper beech, it'll be like a darker purpley look in between. So it's easy to identify as the disease progresses in an area and you have more and more nematodes present in the buds. At emergence, you'll have these more deformed leaves. They'll be more wrinkled and crinkled and weathered, but they won't feel brittle. They'll feel almost like leathery. They'll still feel really sturdy. They'll just be incredibly withered and deformed. And you'll see them on the site we found in Plymouth had both understory American beech and mature European beech we were seeing. And as the disease progresses, you'll see canopy die-off, so you'll see parts of trees that just aren't pushing out leaves anymore as the buds become too infected. And as you go through a growing season, those really like withered and highly damaged leaves will drop. So you'll see really thin canopies later in like July and August as the tree just drops those leaves that aren't quite as useful. And so it's pretty easy to identify. So if you're looking at the trees, to kind of get underneath the leaves and look up against the light, and you can kind of really see the bands. So when you have a low level infestation, you'll see a leaf here or there with one or two of the dark bands. And as it progresses, you'll see full leaves on most of the trees with a lot of the dark banding. And so the picture on the left is from June in Plymouth, and the picture on the right is from October in Plymouth. So as the season progresses, the color will change. You might not see that dark green. It can kind of, the parts of the leaves will start to die off, and you'll see discoloration changing. As the leaves start to change, you'll see leaves being dropped and lost. So the best time of year to actually look to see if you have these symptoms is in early June, after leaf emergence, when you have those nice full-size leaves. Pick a sunny day so you can have that nice light against the backdrop and look for that banding symptoms. And there can be other insects and diseases on beech that can cause kind of similar looking damage, particularly mites. So the picture that's on the left side with the green leaf. So mites will feed on the leaves and cause these patches of discoloration. Usually though, the patches are lighter in color, especially when they're new. As the season goes on, they can kind of brown up and it can be a little bit harder to tell what they were originally, but they're a little bit more patchier. So beech leaf disease will have a more continuous band in between those veins, where mite damage will be like a little spot here, a little spot there, and not necessarily causing a continuous stripe or band right within the veins, and the margins of it may go outside of the veins of one area and into another. And then there can also be anthracnose on beech leaves that happen. And then the big thing that causes a lot of decline in our American beech population is beech bark disease, which has been in Massachusetts since about the 1920s. And it's a scale insect that vectors a fungal pathogen into the bark of the tree, which kind of causes these little pock marks. And early in the season, you can sometimes catch the fungus out. So it'll be these little tiny dots of red or orangish color. And it is a bark related disease, but the stress it causes on the tree and the damage it causes does lead to some leaf symptoms eventually. So right when a tree is about to die, you'll see trees in mid-season die sometimes from this, and their leaves will start to change and get a little bit funky and hang off. But it doesn't have any of that nice striping and banding that we would see with beech leaf disease. So we've confirmed it in Plymouth County, in Bristol County in Massachusetts. We do have sites in Worcester and Hampden County that were possibly symptomatic, but we weren't able to confirm last year. And we'll be doing a lot more intensive surveying throughout the state looking for symptoms of beech leaf disease this year. And even in healthy stands, we're going to put in permanent monitoring plots to kind of track the health of our beech and see when a site does get this disease, how quickly it progresses. It can kill trees. Typically what they're seeing in the Great Lakes area is it killing smaller, younger trees in 3 to 5 years potentially. But since it's such a new disease, it's really difficult to tell what the long-term impacts are going to be. And the way our forests are here in Massachusetts and New England is a little bit different, how the forests grow and the soil types and the composition is out along the Great Lakes. So it'll be different. It'll be interesting to see if the progression does differ out here in Massachusetts. So I'm sure in the upcoming years we'll have a lot more information about this. Unfortunately, at this time, there's just still a lot of mysteries about this disease. All right, so poll question 2. Beech leaf disease symptoms are caused by which of the following agents?
10 seconds and the poll question will be closed.
Again, please answer if you are looking for pesticide credits. Thank you.
So the results of the poll question: nematodes 91%, mites 7%, aphids 2%, wasps 1%.
All right, so it seems like pretty much everyone got that. So yep, it is associated with the nematode, and they seem to be causing most of the damage that we do see associated with this disease. In the future, we might find out that there are other agents also adding to it, but right now, nematodes are the lead agent causing those foliar symptoms that we do see with beech leaf disease. All right, jumping into gypsy moth. Luckily this year, we don't have much to say. So after a rough few years, 2015 to 2019, we saw huge amounts of defoliation across the state, which eventually led to quite a bit of oak mortality. We saw the peak of the oak mortality in 2019 with about 58,000 acres across the state. And when I say 58,000 acres, I don't mean we lost every tree in 58,000 acres. Most of those sites are lower in the 3 to 5% of trees, up to 10% within that acre died. So even in areas where it's very dense, at most we're losing 50% within these small, tiny pockets, less than 5 acres. But it is quite impactful across the state, leading to ecological changes, causing these kind of pockets in our forested areas, but also causing a huge amount of disturbance in our urban areas, roadside trees, around people's homes, and in our parks. We've had to deal with quite a few large oaks that we lost, and it's put a lot of burden onto communities and homeowners, electric companies that kind of have to deal with how to handle this sudden abundance in dead trees we're seeing across the state. So we did see a few more trees that we did lose in 2020, but we really didn't see very much gypsy moth activity at all. We only identified 2 small pockets that had defoliation out, one in Norfolk and one in Middlesex counties. We did get reports of some people that saw some active adults, but didn't see too much feeding earlier. So we are currently out doing our winter egg mass surveys, where we go through the state to randomize locations and look to see if we are seeing a lot of new fresh egg masses, which helped give us an idea of areas that could be at risk for defoliation next year. But at this point, we're not really seeing a lot. So it seems like this outbreak event has kind of settled down, and we're getting back into those typical background levels that we've become used to for gypsy moth. But we still have a lot of secondary invaders out in our oaks. So gypsy moth kind of started this whole event of stressing out our hardwood forests, particularly all of our oak species. So our northern red oaks out in the western and central parts of the states, some of our black oaks out in our coastal areas, our kind of interspersed white oaks that we see here and there. And a lot of what we're seeing is attributed to native insects, things like two-line chestnut borer, which is actually closely related to emerald ash borer, and kind of feeds under the bark. It's a little less aggressive than emerald ash borer and usually doesn't go after healthy trees. But when you have a weakened, stressed tree, they will get in there, start feeding, and the populations kind of explode really quickly. We also found more of our cerambycid borers, which go a little bit deeper, things like red-banded ash borer and hickory borer. So we have a lot of these now abundant in our forests that did cause some of that later mortality. We did see a lot of armillaria, which is a native fungus that's kind of always waiting in the soil and kind of attacks and creeps from the roots up. And other funguses that are abundant out in our forests, are natural native parts of our forest, but really take advantage of this kind of situation. And we're still kind of seeing these lingering effects of these secondary invaders. This year, I got a lot of calls where people were saying, I got gypsy moth, and it wasn't. So we did see a lot of other native defoliators species and some of our less common invasive defoliator species out in the last year. And some of it is people are, after this huge gypsy moth event, are kind of more aware with what's going on with their trees. We had a lot of people that were at home or weren't able to do a lot of the activities they usually did, so we're out in our forest hiking and looking around and kind of taking their time and seeing what's going on with our trees. But good news was that we didn't see a lot of gypsy moth, and a lot of these native defoliators we saw actually don't cause that much damage. The one that is actually the most impactful in the last year has been fall cankerworm. This was actually the 3rd year that we were identifying defoliation of it. So this comes out kind of earlier than gypsy moth, usually like right after bud break. And it looks similar to winter moth, and it actually feeds similarly to winter moth. But we were seeing it out in coastal areas, so out along the Cape, and then particularly out on Nantucket. So this is Nantucket Island, and the areas that look like that purplish brownish are areas that had been completely defoliated by the fall cankerworm. So it was heavy hitting. Usually they go through these little blips where the population will build up, see some feeding. But as we've gone through 3 years with this now, particularly out on Nantucket, they're kind of concerned. This is a really unique habitat type in the center of the island, this like scrubby oak. So it can start causing mortality after multiple years of feeding. So we'll be going out there this spring and taking a look and kind of seeing how it's impacting and if it is causing some tree death this year. But this is the only real native defoliator that's causing a significant negative impact. And the areas out on the Cape and on Martha's Vineyard where we're feeding were much less severe than on Nantucket and not causing any significant long-term impacts to the trees out there. We also saw a white satin moth outbreak this year. So this is actually an invasive that got to Massachusetts in like the 1920s. And we'll see it pop up here and there, and it does cause like a lot of damage. It can cause, we saw about 10 acres this year with almost total defoliation, but it does stay in kind of those small pockets, so like 10 acres. We saw it out in Beartown State Forest, but not really anywhere else. So it'll be curious to see if we see it next year, if we see it in any other areas. It kind of just remains in the background, feeding here and there. But when it does get a chance, it will kind of build up a little bit of a population. And we got a lot of reports about prominent caterpillars. So the 2 big ones we see in this class are oak variable leaf caterpillar and maple saddle prominent. So the oak variable leaf kind of causes this distinctive damage we were getting a lot of reports of, where just like a chunk of the leaf was missing. And it was after storm events when the leaves would fall that we're getting the reports. So the feeding doesn't cause too much damage on the leaves and doesn't on its own cause the leaves to kind of drop. But we were having a lot of wind events and people were noticing this damage after the wind kind of blew the leaves out of the trees. So it seemed pretty widespread through a lot of the state. The maple saddle prominent, we got more reports from out in like the Berkshires, which is more common and where we've seen it historically, since it is more dominant on maples. But we don't expect these populations to build up, but we'll keep our eye on it. It's not since the 70s that we've really seen a significant defoliation event from any of the caterpillars in this family. And then finally, fall webworm. So this was really common in the central part of Massachusetts, particularly around the Quabbin. And usually it's on our non-dominant hardwood types. So you'll find it on like oaks and hickories. But we were seeing it, or no, not oaks and hickories, like cherries and hickories. But we were seeing it on oaks this year. And usually you'll see it on like one side or one branch or a couple of branches here and there, but we were seeing it almost completely covering some trees and areas. It is a little bit later in the season, so you'll see fall webworm in like July into August and then into September. They only feed within the actual web, so they don't cause usually a huge amount of damage, and they do attack leaves later when they've already done a good amount of photosynthesizing for the year and a tree's been able to build up some stores. But these populations are much higher than usual. I know that up in New Hampshire, they actually had areas that were completely defoliated by fall webworm. So it seems to be going through a little bit of an increase in the last 2-3 years. But at this point, still not something that we're seeing huge amount of damage. We're not seeing mortality to trees yet, but it could possibly be something that if it doesn't settle down in the next year or two, we can see scattered mortality here or there. I want to talk a little bit about oak wilt. So oak wilt is actually a disease we do not yet have here in Massachusetts. The closest infection sites are in New York. There's an area outside of Albany that has had infected trees, and then down in Long Island. So we are currently looking for it here in Massachusetts. We received a grant to do surveying and sampling. We surveyed 25 sites this last year throughout most of our counties. An oak wilt can infect any oak. Red oaks are a little bit more susceptible and will decline much more quickly. So a red oak can get infected in June and be dead by August. So in as little as 6 weeks, it can completely kill a healthy tree. So it is something we're concerned about, and if we did find it here in Massachusetts, we would take quick action and attempt to completely eradicate it. So it's a vascular fungal pathogen, so it's kind of similar to Dutch elm disease. It's vectored mostly by insects over like wide distances, so that's how we'd get it here, is the movement from an insect. And then when trees are rooted together, it can spread from grafted together at the roots. It can spread from one oak to a neighboring oak. The biggest identifying symptom that you'll probably see and kind of catches your eye is leaf change and then sudden leaf drop. Usually this happens late July, early August. You'll see discoloration starting at the margins coming in. It almost looks like the color changing for fall, but it'll really start at the edges and work its way in. So you'll still have that green center area and kind of brownish, orangish, reddish moving in. And unlike a lot of other diseases or insects or other issues with oaks, it'll cause the leaves to drop. As you all probably know, oaks love holding on to their leaves. I'm sure you could look out your window right now and still see some oak leaves on trees. But the way this fungus works, it breaks down the layer between the leaf and the twig. So if you see sudden dropping, all of your leaves are dropping off an oak and you're seeing this kind of damage, give me a call right away, because it's something that we're really concerned about and want to take pretty rapid action if we do find oak wilt here in Massachusetts. So southern pine beetle. So this is a very small, tiny little bark beetle. It is smaller than a grain of rice, probably more the size of like a quinoa, very tiny, but they aggregate in huge densities and are able to attack a tree in the hundreds and thousands. So they are able to overcome a tree's defenses and can kill not just a single tree, but a stand of trees within a single growing season. So they have multiple generations per year. So the name is southern pine beetle, so it's from the southern United States, but as our winters have been warming, our summers have been warming, it's kind of been creeping further and further north. Down in the south, it can have up to like 8 generations per year. Here in Massachusetts, we typically see like 2, maybe 3. We haven't had an outbreak here, but we have seen small numbers. Down on Long Island and in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey, they've had large outbreaks events, and they've seen those outbreak events happen when they hit that 3 to 4 generation per year threshold. So the generations overlap. It allows the population to rapidly build, rapidly spread, and kind of move through and kill a lot of trees. And as the name implies, it is southern pine beetle, so it is going after pine trees. It has a pretty broad host of trees that it can survive in, but it has ones that it really prefers. So up here in the Northeast, pitch pine is its preferred host. You can also find it in like red pines, jack pines, black pines, but those aren't really common for us here. Pitch pine is a dominant tree type out in our coastal areas. They have seen it infecting white pines that are like adjacent or interspersed in a pitch pine stands. It can invade that tree and can complete a life cycle, but it's not going after white pines. It's kind of secondary afterwards. So down in the south, they'll see areas that kind of get very hard hit, lose a lot of trees really quickly. And when you do have these outbreak pockets, you need rapid response. So these pictures are from Long Island in some of their mortality pockets. So when you do identify an area that is infested, you do need to remove the infested trees and then cut a buffer around it as well to kind of stop that spread. Here in Massachusetts, we've caught it in traps. We use these black funnel traps, and we've identified it at locations not only out in the southeast where pitch pine is really common, but in smaller pockets. So you'll see these little pitch pine barrens kind of scattered throughout the states, but places like the Montague Plains and then down in Southwick, we did identify southern pine beetle in those locations as well. And when I say we catch it, we catch like 1 or 2 insects. In 2019, I only caught 2 beetles. The most we've ever caught in a single trap was 8. So very low numbers, and we have not found it in a tree yet. So we are still surveying, looking for it. And the area that we see it most repeatedly caught year after year is on Martha's Vineyard. So we don't know at this time if there's a low-level population that lives there, or since it is kind of the closest point to us from Long Island, if they do blow in on the wind from Long Island out to Martha's Vineyard Island every year. So we will continue to monitor throughout the state, and if we did find a pocket where we do find infested trees, we would try to take rapid action to minimize the impact of that outbreak event. But as the kind of climate changes, we're going to be moving to warmer and warmer temperatures. So even on lower emission projection rates, we'll be down in Maryland and Virginia, which is an area that is very common for southern pine beetle to occur. So it's in its native range. It's an area where it has these outbreak events. And there are some things we can do to kind of prepare for an eventual outbreak event. A lot of our pitch pine stands here in Massachusetts are very like dense, overgrown, and not particularly healthy. The pictures on the right are from the Montague Plains, which was cut for completely unrelated to southern pine beetle purposes for wildlife habitat. But that type of cut where it's kind of thinned out and managed, by increasing the space around your trees, it decreases the ability for them to aggregate and spread. It also produces a more healthy environment for the pitch pine. So there are some things people can do to kind of manage your pitch pine preemptively to kind of decrease the risk for attack, but it's not a guarantee that you won't get it. So on to our third poll question. What is the preferred host species in Massachusetts for southern pine beetle?
Nicole, while folks are answering the poll question, I did want to mention that we have approximately 5 minutes left in our scheduled length of time for today. Not to rush you, but I do have a bunch of questions yet again. So just a friendly reminder.
Okay.
Poll question will be closing in 5 seconds. Okay, so most people got it right. 89% of people got it right.
All right, good job, guys. All right, so cruising along since we're short on time, moving into hemlock pests and diseases. So after a few years where hemlock willia delgid populations had kind of been on a decrease and our hemlocks are actually looking pretty good across the state, we've kind of had a boost in the population in the last year. So our last winter was nice and warm, 40-degree days, which is really what hemlock willia delgid loves. It actually feeds best and survives best in those nice, like 40-degree kind of conditions. And then it has 2 generations a year, so the population can really kind of rebound. So we're seeing across the state quite a bit of a population increase and an increase in damage caused by hemlock woolly adelgid again. And this winter has been favorable to hemlock woolly adelgid once again. So usually at the end of February, we go out and take samples and see how much of the population survived. But with the kind of weather we've been having, we haven't had particularly cold days, and we've been having pretty steady temperatures, which also benefits the adelgid. So it seems like we're going to go into this next growing season at a disadvantage for it. We do release biocontrol species. So we've released Sasagia skimnasugi in the 90s and early 2000s. And we currently release Laracobius nigrinus. So this year we released 500 of the little beetles. So they're actually predatory beetles, and they feed directly on the eggs and the nymph stages of the adelgids. So we haven't had the best success here, since we do have years where our population does crash, so they don't have enough food to survive. But they've been a very useful tool down in the South. Even places like New Jersey, they've been incredibly successful at establishing them. So we do still try to find ideal sites that are a little bit more protected, that have more consistent adelgid populations, to try to get these established. But we do have the other pressure of elongate hemlock scale, which now is widespread throughout the state. We're seeing it, and the densities are kind of building. And unlike hemlock woolly adelgid, which can be negatively impacted by winter temperatures and die off, elongate hemlock scale is an armored scale and is a little bit more resistant to those winter temperatures, and a little bit more persistent once it gets to a site. So we see the most impact at sites that have the dual pressure of the hemlock woolly adelgid and the elongate hemlock scale. So we do treat on some of our DCR properties, and when we do treat, we choose to use dinotefron products because it is a little bit more impactful on the elongate hemlock scale than imidacloprid. So we do treat some of our old growth hemlocks, some of our really like historically and culturally important hemlocks, and some of our old parks like Walden, and then some of our just like our really good example trees that are really significant. So we're trying to protect those in these sites that have a lot of adelgid and elongate hemlock scale. This last year we also saw some hemlock looper, which is a native insect. I got a call, someone that suddenly had a lot of dieback on hemlocks. And when I went out to look, it was probably not a huge amount of trees, probably 10 to 20 trees that had kind of had a lot of dieback, and some had already died. But when going through and looking at the symptoms, it was from the hemlock looper feeding. So it's a little caterpillar that feeds in June, takes bites out of the needles and causes the tree to drop the needles early. And when there's enough pressure from it, it can cause the tree to kind of lose too many needles in a growing season and not be able to survive. But stays pretty small. In the 80s, we've had populations that were really big and needed treatment, but we haven't seen anything close to that in quite a while. All right, poll question number 4.
Poll question will be closing in 10 seconds. The results of the poll question: on choice number 1, 67%, Number 2, 11%. Number 3, 12%. Number 4, 11%.
All right, so the correct answer was A, Leucobius nigrinus, which is the current predatory beetle we have been trying to establish here in Massachusetts. I'm gonna jump to the end because I think I'm out of time, but I want you guys to have my contact information in case you guys have any questions. So if you have any questions about this, anything we covered or any other forest health topic, if you see anything weird out there, so my teams are always out there working and surveying, but we can't see every tree, we can't get to every town even. So we always like having eyes out there, and if you see something weird or suspicious, take a picture and share it with us. We much rather go through things or talk to people and have it be nothing than to kind of miss out on something that can be significant. So my email address is there. And then if you go on the mass.gov website, we have several pages about some of our bigger insects and diseases. And also my phone number is up there, and the phone number of some of my forest health specialists that specialize in some of the insects. So don't ever hesitate to reach out and give us a call.
Thank you so much, Nicole. I am going to try to get one of the questions in that came in quite frequently. It's with regard to the biological control of emerald ash borer. There's a lot of concern that essentially were these wasps studied to make sure that they could not potentially become a problem for other native insects?
Yes. So so back in like the olden days, like gypsy moth, they were not good at biocontrols, but nowadays things are very thoroughly researched. So they're researched first in their native country. So all of these are from Asia, and then they are brought here to lab facilities where they're thoroughly tested within lab conditions under quarantine. And it's only after they prove that it is not something that's a threat to any of our native insects is it then released out into the forest. So these are very host-specific insects that really only go after emerald ash borer and do not impact any of our native communities.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your presentation, Nicole. And as she's mentioned, you can see her contact information on the screen here. We also have everyone's questions that they've sent in the Q&A function here available, and I can share those with Nicole so that hopefully we can post some answers to all of these questions, including for the first presentation that we weren't able to get to. All right, so without further ado, I do need to, and thank you again, Nicole, for your time and your presentation today. I do need to switch to show my screen so that we can talk about the association and pesticide credits. So let me see, just to make sure that everyone can see that in the next couple of seconds here. There we go. And I'll try to open this up. Sorry for the delay with my PowerPoint here. All right, so let's talk a bit about the association credits. Today we do have Massachusetts certified arborists continuing education credits available. It's a half credit per presentation, so please, after today's webinar, fill out the webinar confirmation form for MCAs available at the website displayed on the screen. The same